So I know Falk, her work on the computational modeling of cognition, mostly within the resource rational framework. It's a framework that tries to explain biases in cognition as the byproducts of a sort of rational, adaptive mechanism. I believe since he's moved to UCLA, he's started working on altruism, how to get people to be more altruistic. And so I'm not familiar with this work, but I hope to learn more today. So welcome, Falk.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. This will be a very high-level talk, and I have two goals. The first one is to highlight that investigating how human decision-making can be improved is a great opportunity for cognitive scientists to make a positive impact on society, especially if the research focuses on important societal decisions. And I hope to inspire some of the undergraduate students and young researchers to consider this opportunity when planning their careers. And my second goal is to share my unique theoretical perspective on improving human decision-making that developed out of my prior work in computational cognitive science. And I want to illustrate how it can be applied to design and refine tools and interventions for improving decision-making. One moment, I have to bring my cursor back to my screen here. Where is it? Investigating how people can make good decisions is a very timely topic, because the decisions that humanity faces this century are absolutely crucial for the continued survival and flourishing of humanity. We have the opportunity to shape the future in a very positive way, creating a future that's much better than our present or past, but we also have the capacity to completely destroy ourselves and our future. And which path humanity will take critically depends on how we will approach crucial decisions about topics such as climate change, the application and regulation of advanced artificial intelligence, navigating great power conflicts, and mitigating the risk of nuclear war, as well as risk of engineered pandemics that might be much more lethal than the pandemics we've seen so far. Cognitive science can help us understand how people make such decisions. And that includes both understanding the motivational mechanisms as well as understanding the reasoning through which people pursue those motives when making these societally important decisions. I believe that if we want to positively influence these crucial decisions through means such as education or regulation or decision support tools, it is imperative that we understand how people respond to such interventions, how they make decisions, and how the way in which they make decisions can change depending on, for instance, educational interventions. If we do not have a solid understanding of the decision mechanisms and the learning mechanisms for which these decision mechanisms can improve, we run the risk that our interventions will either backfire or will fail to be effective. And given the high stakes involved in the upcoming decisions that humanity faces this century, this would be a very high price to pay. And therefore, it's really important for cognitive scientists to invest, to try to bring the best possible evidence and strongest, most rigorous theory to bear on the question of how important societal decisions can be improved. There are many different approaches for which decisions can be improved. This includes redesigning the decision situations, changing the environment such that people's intuitive ways of making decisions will lead to better choices, can also involve aiming to improve people's character through education so that they will make, the future generations of decision makers will make those decisions with good intentions. It can involve giving people better tools for decision support. It can involve providing decision makers with more accurate information and reliable forecasts about how their decisions may impact the future. It can involve training people to more rationally update their beliefs in response to new evidence, and it can involve improving people's decision-making literacy through training. Several labs here at the University of Pennsylvania have done really crucial foundational work in all of these areas and are at the cutting edge of these fields. My presentation cannot possibly do justice to all of the great work that has been done and is being done here. So instead, I'll use the limited time that I have to outline my own theoretical perspective, and I hope to convey how it might be helpful for advancing these important research programs. These interventions I just showed you differ in the extent to which they give people, preserve or even enhance people's autonomy about what to do. At the low end of the autonomy continuum, there are laws that prohibit certain actions or require certain actions. And at the upper end of the autonomy spectrum, there are interventions that increase people's capacity to pursue their own goals and values in a more effective manner, and this is known as boosting. And in between, there's nudging, where we retain people's autonomy to choose, but we change the environment so that they're more likely to make a choice that the choice architect deems to be socially desirable and beneficial for society. Despite a lot of progress that has been made with all of these approaches, there's still many practical and theoretical obstacles to improving decision-making. Improving people's decision-making literacy remains challenging, partly because we don't yet understand what the best decision strategies are that real people can use when they're confronted with decisions whose complexity is very large compared to the limited time and limited cognitive resources that they have available to make those choices. Moreover, our efforts to design educational interventions for teaching people how to make better decisions and to improve their character and motives are limited by our relatively crude models of how people's decision-making is shaped by learning. And our efforts to design environments that make people more likely to make good choices is limited by the accuracy of our models for predicting what choices people will make. So to address these issues, my research starts from the fundamental question of what are the best decision strategies that people could use given their cognitive limitations and the challenges of decision-making in the real world. Building on answers to this foundational question, I then investigate how the strategies that people do use differ from these optimal strategies, thereby identifying opportunities for improvement and also getting at more mechanistically precise models of people's actual decision strategies by using these precise models of optimal decision-making as a starting point for reverse engineering people's decision strategies. Building on those findings, I will argue we can design optimal nudges by optimizing what decisions people are likely to make based on a model of their decision process. We can also use our models of optimal decision-making to create decision-making tools that help align people's decision processes with optimal decision processes. And in a complementary line of research, I'm investigating the basic questions of how can people learn to make better decisions and to make decisions in a better way, and use the resulting models of learning to inform educational interventions for helping people learn better decision strategies. All of these lines of research converge on the common goal of improving people's decisions in such a way that it would benefit the future of humanity. So in this talk, I'll start with the foundational research on identifying optimal strategies for human decision-making. So what kind of decision-making would you like to see so that the future of humanity is most likely to go really well? My answer to that question is rational altruism. Rational altruism has two components. One is impartial beneficence, meaning that the goal of the decision maker is to maximally benefit the well-being of everyone who is impacted by the decision now or in the future, weighing the well-being of every sentient being just as highly as their own well-being. And the second component of rational altruism is rationality, using the best evidence and the most accurate reasoning in order to identify which actions are best for achieving this altruistic objective of benefiting everyone as much as possible. This is an ideal, and we will see how idealistic it is when we think more precisely about what it would entail. So concretely, what it would entail is choosing the actions with the highest expected positive social impact. Social impact is the difference in the global long-term well-being if you take a certain action minus the global long-term well-being when you don't take the action. The difficulty arises when you take into account that each action may lead to exponentially many future scenarios, far too many for you to consider them all. And if you wanted to really base your decision on a calculation of expected social impact, you would have to weigh the social impact in all of these practically infinitely many future scenarios by their respective probability. Now, if you try to do that for a decision such as which career to pursue, that would not only be impractical, but it would actually be lethal, because you'd be thinking yourself to death, never reaching a decision, and consequently never being able to do any good. So this illustrates that the ideal of rational altruism is unfortunately unattainable for us mere mortals. It is unattainable because our finite time and our bounded cognitive resources constrain how much computation we can perform. So given that this ideal is unattainable, how else should we go about figuring out how we can do good in the world? Prior research on bounded rationality has pointed out that because of our cognitive limitations, our limited time and our limited information, we are constrained to using heuristics. However, the space of possible heuristics is very vast, and some of them may be much better than others. So what heuristics should we use? My answer to that question is that we should use the heuristic that if we as a real person use them in the real world under the real constraints, then the decision that we will make as a consequence of that will be as good as it could possibly be. And I refer to those heuristics as resource rational heuristics. The theory of resource rationality formalizes this idea mathematically, and it thereby combines the principles of expected utility theory, Herbert Simon's insights about both people's cognitive limitations and the importance of the structure of the environment, and empirical findings about people's cognitive limitations. Formalizing that mathematically then allows us to derive optimal heuristics for specific types of decisions for a certain model of people's cognitive capacities. And we can then use those optimal heuristics to boost people's decision-making by teaching them to make decisions in that practically feasible yet optimal way. Resource rationality can also help us develop descriptive models of how people actually make decisions, and then use those models as a basis for designing effective nudges. And it can also help us develop models of learning that can inform how we go about teaching people better decision strategies in boosting. So to make it possible to derive these optimal heuristics, the theory of resource rationality has to extend expected utility theory from a prescription of optimal behavior of idealized agents that have infinite computational power to a prescription for optimal cognitive strategies and mental representations for real people who have to make decisions with limited time and with bounded cognitive resources. Formally, resource rationality defines a decision mechanism as optimal when it is the best possible solution to a constraint optimization problem, where the constraints basically that the mechanism has to be implementable in the brain with all of the limitations that we know about. And the objective function has two components. The first component is the expected utility or moral value of the decisions that the person will make if they use that decision mechanism in the kinds of situations that they're likely to encounter in a given environment. This corresponds to the accuracy or decision quality. And the second component is the cost that the person would incur if they actually use that strategy in real-world situations. This is primarily an opportunity cost or a time cost, and that's motivated by the consideration that if you spend weeks or months on one particular decision, that means you have less time to actually do good, and you have less time to make other decisions well that might be as important or more important. From this mathematical theory, we can derive models of different aspects of cognition. And over the years, we've applied it to many different aspects of cognition, including planning, goal pursuit, judgment under uncertainty, decisions from experience, as well as decisions from description, multi-alternative risky choice, strategy selection, cognitive control, proactivity, as well as some other cognitive phenomena. And in each of those cases, the models we developed were able to explain some aspect of human cognition more accurately than the best previous models and theories. And they were generally able to provide a unifying explanation for a relatively wide range of phenomena. Taken together, these findings suggest that resource rationality is a promising framework for modeling human cognition and human decision-making in particular. Based on that, how can we apply resource rational models to improve human decision-making? Give me a moment while I retrieve my presentation. So there are different ways in which we can use resource rational models to inform interventions for improving decision-making. The first intervention that I'd like to talk about is nudging. Nudging means changing the environment so that the heuristics that people use will lead to more socially beneficial decisions. The way in which resource rationality can be used for nudging is that it can give us a model that can predict what choice people will make if we change the environment in one way, and what choice they will make if we change the environment in another way. And then we can explore all the space of possible changes to the environment and choose the one for which the resource rational model predicts the most beneficial decision in expectation over what the situation might be. This has recently been formalized by my collaborators, Fred Callaway, Tom Griffiths, and Matthew Hardy, as optimal nudging. And the basic idea here is that optimal nudging means to choose a modification to the environment such that the resource rational heuristic that people will use in a modified environment will make a choice that is as good as possible according to the goals of the choice architect. And one thing that resource rational models are very good at capturing is people's sensitivity to how difficult or easy it is to incorporate different pieces of information into their decision. So optimal nudging with resource rational models can help us choose which information we should make easily accessible to decision makers, which information we might want to make more difficult to access, so that they will choose options that are good for them and also for society at large. And that framework can capture a wide range of different nudges and effects in nudging and can be used to optimize them. Before this paper appeared, I worked on a precursor to optimal nudging, which was called optimal gamification. In optimal gamification, the nudges are points and badges that are added to people's to-do lists. And we choose these points in such a way that even a short-sighted decision maker who doesn't have the capacity or motivation to think many steps into the future will choose the actions that are most suitable for them to achieve their long-term goals. It thereby effectively changes the decision situation such that rather than the task superficially visible attributes characterizing them in terms of how fun or dry they are when you do them, these tasks are then characterized by how valuable they are to the future in terms of the points. And when a short-sighted decision maker uses that information, then they're much more likely to make far-sighted decisions. And we found that this intervention reduced procrastination from 40% to just 15%, and also helped people prioritize their more important projects over their less important projects. So my second take-home message for you is that we can use resource rational models to compute optimal nudges, and that such nudges can help people overcome motivational obstacles and pursue their own goals more effectively. Now I'd like to take a slight turn and tell you about another way in which we can use resource rational models to improve decision-making, and that is by identifying shortcomings of human decision-making as a deviation from resource rational strategies, and then use that knowledge to improve human decision-making by shifting it towards those resource rational strategies. So over the years, as we investigated resource rational models more closely, we increasingly found that people sometimes deviate from them. In a recent paper, we found that the degree to which people were resource rational was about 63%. That was mostly because they didn't always adapt their strategies optimally to the environment. And in another paper on planning, we found that people systematically deviate from resource rational planning strategies by prioritizing forward planning and not paying enough attention to the long-term consequences of the decisions that they're making. That has important implications also for societal decisions, such as decisions in social dilemmas. In a recent study, we found that compared to the resource rational ideal, participants gave insufficient consideration to long-term consequences and other less obvious consequences, such as consequences that are indirect, consequences that affect distant outgroups, consequences that affect some abstract large group of people rather than individuals, and consequences that are highly uncertain. These types of consequences are disproportionately often overlooked by people compared to immediate consequences for themselves that are certain. And overall, we found that people only considered about 30% of the most morally significant consequences that a resource rational decision maker should consider. And that led them to make choices that were more selfish and less altruistic and less beneficial to the greater good than the choices that a resource rational decision maker would have made. So that highlights that there's opportunity for improvement by shifting people's decision making towards resource rational altruism. So my third take-home message for you is that human decision making still has significant room for improvement before it reaches the resource rational standard, which is the best that people can do without external tools. And building on that, we can now devise interventions that shift people's heuristics towards resource rational heuristics, thereby bringing them closer to the best that they're able to do. This is known as boosting, and there are two types of boosting that I will talk about. The first one is to give people decision-making tools that guide them through the application of resource rational strategies, like flowcharts. And later on, I'll talk about training decision makers, teaching them strategies that they can use autonomously. For this goal of designing decision aids, we leveraged our resource rational framework together with artificial intelligence to automatically discover optimal strategies for human decision making. And then we again used AI to automatically generate flowcharts and textual descriptions of the optimal decision procedure that we could provide to people and let them use them when making their own decisions, thereby changing the strategy that they used. One proof of concept application of this approach was to sequential decision problems where people don't just make a one-shot decision, but rather they will take a sequence of actions, and after each action, they get some outcome and also get to a new state where they can make another decision. And we applied our method for discovering resource rational heuristics to such a sequential decision-making task where the range of possible outcomes increased from the first step to the second step to the third step and so on, such that the outcomes at the last step were most variable and therefore most informative for what the best initial choice is. We found that for such environments, the resource rational heuristic is what we call the future first heuristic, where instead of thinking forward one step at a time from the first decision, you're trying to identify the best outcome that you could achieve in 5 steps, if it's a 5-step task, and then work backwards from that. So you're basically trying to identify a good long-term goal, the best state that you can get to in the long term, and then you're planning how to get there. That is the future first heuristic that we discovered with our method. And we then automatically design decision aids that formulate that strategy in words and instructions that people can follow when making their own choices. Here's what that strategy looks like for this road trip planning task. We are trying to plan a road trip that arrives at one of these airports. The passenger has to stay overnight at these different locations. It costs different amounts of money. You can find out how much money it costs using the search engine. And the strategy that is recommended is that people should first look up the airport hotels and the most distant hotels first, basically. That text was basically automatically generated by our AI method. And when we applied the same method to choosing between different mortgages that have different interest rates and different time periods, then our method recommended that people should first inspect the interest rates for the longest and latest time period and choose their mortgage primarily based on that information. We found that when people were supportive of these decision aids, there were very substantial improvements in their decision quality in both of these scenarios, as you can see by comparing these orange plots to the blue ones. So my fourth take-home message for you is that deriving boosts, in this case decision aids, from the principle of resource rationality is a promising approach to improving human decision-making. Now I'd like to switch gears to a complementary approach that leverages people's capacity to learn how to make better decisions and supports that learning process. So in our basic research on learning how to make decisions, we found that with experience, people in an environment where it pays off to think many steps ahead, such as playing chess, people do learn to switch to relatively short-sighted strategies to more far-sighted strategies that consider the more long-term outcomes of their initial choices. Across many experiments, we consistently find that the more experience a person gathers in a particular environment, the more resource rational their strategy becomes. That is, we observe that their decision strategies change on a decision by decision by decision basis, each time the decision becoming, on average, more resource rational. And that means that people will learn different strategies depending on what environment they are, and those strategies generally change towards the strategy that is most resource rational in that environment, but they don't always get all the way there. And that phenomenon of people adapting their decision strategies does not only occur in these relatively abstract planning tasks, but it also occurs in moral dilemmas, where people have to arbitrate the conflict between deontological moral rules, such as you shall not kill, you shall not lie, with cost-benefit reasoning about what action would actually save the largest number of people. And we find that even in this very complex, very realistic scenario, people's decision strategies are remarkably malleable. That is, if we put people in an environment where breaking the rules always has devastating consequences, then they learn to stick to the rules increasingly more across decisions. But if we put them in an environment where overriding these moral heuristics that are rules by their own cost-benefit reasoning about what would be better for the greater good, then they learn to rely more on that kind of reasoning and are more willing to break the rules as time goes on, and they gain more experience about what works well in this environment. So even quite fundamental aspects of people's decision-making that are relevant to societal decision-making are quite malleable to learning from experience. And that can have good consequences or bad consequences depending on what experience people have and how they think about that experience. So my take-home message from this part is that people can learn to use better decision strategies, and generally these decision strategies become more resource rational with experience. And that brings me to the next part of my talk, which is helping people learn better decision strategies by capitalizing on their capacity to adapt how they make choices. So here again, we used artificial intelligence to discover strategies, but unlike in the previous example where we instructed people to follow the discovered strategies, we designed an intelligent pedagogical agent that teaches them those strategies and helps them discover those strategies for themselves by learning from experience. Concretely, we let people practice with feedback, and the feedback is generated by a cognitive tutor that selects a decision problem for people to solve. It then observes how people make their decisions by tracking which pieces of information they inspect in which order, and gives them feedback on each of these decision operations. And the feedback is optimized so as to direct their learning towards the optimal decision strategy as quickly as possible. Here is a video of what that looks like in a very simple example. We have more complex, more naturalistic versions of the tutor as well. But just for illustration, this is what the feedback looks like when you make a suboptimal choice about how to plan. This is what a positive feedback looks like. And this was the first trial. On the second trial, the participant already learned a lesson that it's most valuable to inspect the most long-term consequences. And as a consequence, they did better in this trial. And on this trial, they made the worst possible error, which is they tried to act without any planning, and therefore they got a very unpleasant feedback penalty that is usually a strong learning signal for people, something that is so uncomfortable that they want to avoid it in subsequent decisions. We found that this type of feedback very substantially accelerated the rate at which people discover the future first heuristics that inspects the long-term outcomes first. And not only that, but it also increased the proportion of people who were able to discover it at all. And moreover, what people learned from the tutor, they also applied it to an independent post-test where nobody received any feedback. And not only that, but they also transferred it from this very simple artificial task to a more realistic planning problem like this road trip problem. As you can see here, when we switched to the road trip problem, the group that was trained by the tutor still performed substantially better than the groups that I received less sophisticated feedback or no feedback. In In subsequent work in that project, we also developed tutors for increasingly more realistic decision problems, such as choosing which project a company should pursue. There we build a tutor that can significantly increase people's ability to choose good projects in problems that are taken from the decision support literature. We also applied metacognitive feedback directly to people's day-to-day activities in the real world. In this project, we developed an intelligent tutor that monitors which activities people choose to do while they're working at their computer and gives them positive feedback when they focus on the activities that they said they wanted to do, and negative feedback when they get distracted. And then again, positive feedback when they return their focus to their initial goal. And we found that this executive control training rapidly increased the degree to which people were able to stay focused on their computer-based work compared to a control group that used an app that did not give them feedback. So my take-home message from this part is that metacognitive feedback can help people to more quickly learn how to make better decisions. And finally, I'd like to highlight another way in which we can help people learn better decision strategies faster, which is to engage them in systematic reflection about how they make their choices and how the way they make their choices affects the quality of the resulting outcomes. So the way this works is that we have people make a decision, and then we engage them in a Socratic dialogue and show that they learn how to make better decisions through this systematic reflection. As a proof of concept, we applied this in this 5-step planning task here, where people first make a plan, and then after they've made and executed the plan on the first trial, they're asked to reflect on their planning process by describing which strategy they use, evaluating how well that strategy worked for this decision, formulating a lesson, and then planning how to apply that lesson in future decisions. And we found that when people were guided through the systematic reflection, then the quality of their decisions decreased much more rapidly and reached a higher asymptotic level of decision quality than for people who practice the task without systematically reflecting about it, showing that it doesn't only matter what we experience, but it also matters how we reflect on our experience. So my final take-home message, therefore, is that systematic reflection can help people discover resource-rational decision strategies more quickly and more frequently. In summary, in this talk, I've argued that first, resource rationality is a promising approach for modeling human decision-making. Secondly, that we can use these resource rational models to compute optimal nudges to improve people's choices. And then I took a slight turn by highlighting that although resource rational models are useful, they're not perfect in the sense that people are not fully resource rational. And that means we can use resource rational models to identify systematic biases in their decision-making that are actually overcomable through training. And one way of doing that is to design decision aids that guide people through the application of resource rational heuristics. And we have some evidence that this is, in fact, very effective at improving their decisions and decision processes in particular. And another way in which people can improve their decision strategies is through learning from experience. And that can be facilitated by giving people feedback on their decision process rather than just the choices. And it can also be facilitated by engaging people in systematic reflection about their decision process through Socratic dialogue. In conclusion, I hope to have convinced you that in general, cognitive science can generate knowledge that could be very useful for improving crucial decisions. And secondly, that the paradigm of rational altruism, resource rationality, and learning how to decide are useful for generating such knowledge. And I'd like to close with highlighting that I think the most valuable research lies ahead of us in applying these approaches to studying how people can learn to make better societal decisions and better moral decisions in context where it really matters. And that work mostly remains to be done. With that, I'd like to thank the members of my former Rationality Enhancement Group, as well as our funders, our collaborators, especially Fred Callaway, Max Meyer, and Tom Griffiths, and the brand new members of my Rational Altruism Lab at UCLA. Our mission is to identify and then rigorously investigate psychological questions that are crucial for improving the trajectory of human civilization, and we are currently looking for both PhD students and postdocs. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Yes, Barbara.
Really interesting, thank you. Maybe this is an unfair question, but I'll ask it anyway. How do you approach a situation where people disagree about the resources? Say, for example, the war between Russia and Ukraine. Does this framework apply to difficult decisions like that?
I think whenever we can conduct a decision analysis, laying out the costs and benefits and models of the consequences, then resource rationality is just one step further from that decision analysis towards more practical strategies. And there are, of course, many challenges involved in decision analysis and correctly characterizing the resources and options available and predicting the consequences. And those are important challenges that are applicable basically to any such approach. Not sure.
Follow it up with them. What do you see as the limitations, the biggest limitations?
I think a very big limitation is that it relies, that all approaches except for nudging rely on people's willingness to invest effort in improving their decision-making. So whenever we try to apply it to improve people's decision-making literacy, take-up has been somewhat limited, and it's a sort of a challenge to sufficiently motivate people and make the learning activity sufficiently fun that they're actually willing to engage with them. And maybe another way of interpreting your initial question would be, how important is it that we have an accurate understanding of what people are cognitively capable of and what all of the various cognitive costs and limitations are? And I think we are still fairly uncertain about those. The best existing work that exists on the topic is, I think, in the work on cognitive architectures, and we can combine, we can apply our resource rational framework to cognitive architectures to get the best, to build on the best knowledge that's available. And I think that's still not so much. But in many cases, the important resource limitations that we have a better handle on are things like time and information. And the applications that I've pursued so far mostly focused on those resources, and there we didn't have that challenge. But if you want to go into more profoundly cognitive limitations like working memory, then the challenges are much bigger there.
Thank you.
Or did you see much for the one study where you had the gamification and you showed that, like, with like that feedback for like the YouTube versus Word, like, I guess my question is, what do you do to keep up the motivation after gamification? Are there like methods to kind of taper off these like boosting, but at the same time still like retain like the same level like performance as during gamification? Or is it kind of inevitable that you will have a decrease once you remove the boosting?
We have not studied that directly, but one thing that we have done is to apply gamification to habit formation. And we found that the habits, well, the frequency of the behavior persisted to be higher when people had been supported with gamification in the initial phase. And so benefits of gamification could persist to the extent that it helps people develop productive habits. and maybe also to explore productive work habits and experiencing the self-reinforcing benefits of those productive work habits. So in that way, it could sustain itself. But we haven't empirically tested out.
I guess there seemed like a funny switch from the first half of the talk to the second half, where at the beginning you're acknowledging, rational models people don't act like the rational model predicts because they have all these limitations. And if you incorporate that then into the top function, then you should be able to capture behavior better. But then in the second half, you're saying, well, actually, people don't even meet that standard. And then, I mean, the counter argument, I guess, is think of the same as the rational. Well, people say the rational models, you just don't have the right, like the actual resources available to people are not what you put in the model. So how could you tell that people are not resource rational, or what would that even mean? Seems like a tricky distinction between the way that you were talking about the first half. Second half.
Yes, it is tricky. You can refine resource rational models with ever more assumptions about additional limitations and thereby make them perform increasingly more poorly and maybe also increasingly more human-like. I think the way to counter in that way, but the danger of doing so is that you would rationalize something that is inherently irrational, and we would like to avoid that. And the way to avoid this would be to ground your assumptions about cognitive limitations in direct empirical evidence about what people's cognitive capacities actually are, such as measuring their working memory capacity, rather than just assuming their working memory is just one item because that is best for explaining their behavior in a decision-making task. So basically constraining your constraints with empirical data on what people actually are and are not capable of.
Here's seeing socioeconomic differences amongst your approaches to empirical decision making.
We have not studied that, so this is an interesting question, but I can't say anything about it. Sudeep?
Yeah, really interesting talk. It seems to me that one of the major challenges in extending computational cognitive science to the real world is essentially representational. How do you represent the space of everyday environment, the space of nudges, the space of, complex emotions and cognitions that influence behavior? And so I love the demonstrations to find the optimal path to the airport task that you have. But I'm kind of curious, have you tried to solve this almost representational challenge when porting your models into the real world? Let's say if someone wants to go to the gym or say be vegetarian or do any of the other thousands of things that would make them better off, make the world better off. They have to work within a very complex environment, and they have very complex cognitions and emotions influencing their behavior. So how do you represent that? Because that's the first step to deriving the optimal nudge or the optimal boost.
So one aspect of your question that resource rationality has started to tackle is how do people represent the environment? There, the principle of resource rationality can be applied to find what we call a resource rational representation, one that achieves an optimal balance between the cognitive complexity of solving the task as represented in the mind versus the loss in accuracy due to the simplification. And that has been applied to explain some of the apparent errors people make in planning, and also in goal pursuit, or controlling complex dynamical systems. There we have models according to which people ignore most of the relationships between the various variables in order to be able to plan efficiently. So that is one aspect that resource rationality has begun to address. But that's only part of your question, and I think I'm not particularly well positioned to answer the other part, which is, I think, a challenge for all cognitive scientists. And I think it's an important effort for cognitive scientists to go out in the real world and try to model real world scenarios as accurately as possible, and to then do research with these more naturalistic models of what decision situations in the real world are really like. Basically building simulations of real world problems and then using them for research. That is another component that I can offer in response to your question. Yes.
So let's do questions, one on behalf of and myself, please. Thank you so much. So I guess my friend's question is like, he's wondering if these computational models could be applied to ethical dilemmas. Like, for example, if like an AI kills someone, like do we blame the AI or the person who killed it or some combination of both? And could we apply these balances and like this cost benefit analysis to start answering like these more ethical questions?
In general, I think the resource rational approach can be applied to questions of morality and ethics, and that's something I'm actually very excited about, to see what are optimal moral rules or optimal moral heuristics for people who have all kinds of cognitive and psychological limitations. If we were unbounded agent with infinite computational power, we would probably do really well if we were utilitarians and we just calculated the moral utility of doing one action versus another. But because we have all of these limitations and how far we think and which consequences we consider and which ones we overlook, this utilitarian approach can go horribly wrong in practice. And therefore, we are actually better off to also have deontological rules and follow those rules. And I think we can derive the necessity and moral importance of rules and other types of morality from the resource, by applying the principle of resource rationality to the utilitarian meta-ethical framework. So that's one way in which we can improve it. And that in general applies not just to human morality, but for the morality of any computational and computationally bounded system. And the morality for an AI will likely be different than the morality for human because it has different computational constraints and maybe different also informational constraints. And because of all of that, the optimal morality for an AI might be quite different from the optimal morality for a human, even though both serve the same higher level purpose that is so specified at this meta-ethical level.
How does this kind of research and research rationality been applied in like more social settings, like say the dilemma is kind of like not choosing the really no efficient outcome out of like a lack of trust or wanting to, I guess, like get more benefit for yourself? Are there ways to do that or train people to like, make, I guess, decisions in like these more social settings, like when you're working as one other person?
I'm aware of one paper that derived resource rational decision making to they applied it to prisoners' dilemmas. So that was by Fred Callaway and a collaborator from economics. And other than that, I think this is an exciting frontier for future research. It's very much in the direction of extending the resource rational approach to realistic and practically important decisions, and most of them are social in nature.
If you could talk a little bit more about the systematic reflection experiment, the reflection learning experiment. The reason this interests me is that one, I guess, concern with the other approach is that there might be, or one concern might be that there's individual differences. That on the utility side, I might weigh some of these considerations differently than you would, and on the cost side, some of my limitations might be different than your limitations. And so from the point of view of specifying a problem and then telling everyone this is the heuristic that everybody should use, right? You might worry that might not be the best solution for that person.
Right.
So if there was a method, it strikes me that this might be a method by which an individual could discover the best heuristic for themselves.
Yes.
What if their utilities might be different, their costs might be different.
Exactly. That's a big motivation for this approach, and I like it for that reason too.
And I guess how maybe you could talk a little bit more about how you design this in terms of, I mean, it seems a little bit like it's borrowing from methods of teaching and learning that we've used for quite some time, if it's Socratic dialogue.
Yes, we did build on previous design theories for reflection scripts. In particular, one developed by Victoria Palmer-Schindler for supporting learning from experience through chatbot dialogues, or reflection scripts, as she calls it. But another design approach that we are pursuing with the more advanced versions of this in current work is to think about the optimal learning algorithm for learning better decision strategies and guiding people step by step through that learning algorithm, trying to, through questions, getting them to compute the things that they would need to compute in order to learn a better decision strategy. And that's the approach I'm sort of most excited about. But of course, it's also good to build on all of the things that prior research on learning and pedagogy has found to be effective. And this is a very primitive example, but it's the first example that we did.
Yes, this is related to
Oh.
Deep's comment,
Mhm.
but I wonder if you've thought of how to use these models in a socially distributed way, because people who make bad decisions often cannot help themselves, and they don't even want to look at their decision or analyzing and thinking, people who are intoxicated have emotional feelings of overwhelm, that people teach a family to do these different components, and they could arrive at something that's more often.
That's a very good idea. I think it is can be pursued within this framework, because the framework is very general about what constitutes the decision maker or the cognitive architecture, and it could well be a multi-agent architecture, and you could derive optimal social strategies for decentralized agents working together. It's an exciting direction. We haven't pursued it yet, and it's going to be more complicated, but it's really exciting. I can't really say much more.
Reflection on is there any analysis of whether the participants implemented those services in their daily lives outside of the experiment?
In this experiment, we did not test out. We have some assessments of transfer for the cognitive tutors that I showed you earlier. Our best hope for improving people's decision-making in real life is to have them reflect on real-life decisions directly. And we're running experiments on this right now.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Falk, and thank you everyone for coming. Give a round of applause.
Thank you very much for your great questions.